Most physicians are great at making money, but terrible at growing it. You can work 60-hour weeks while your savings sit in accounts earning basically nothing. NURP changes this. It's algorithmic trading designed specifically for busy professionals who don't have time to watch markets. AI-powered strategies that work while you're seeing patients. No day trading, no guesswork, just systematic wealth building designed for people with demanding careers. Built for physicians who want their money working as hard as they do. Check out start.nurp.com/doctors. That's start.nurp.com/doctors to learn more. NURP is a paid sponsor of this episode. All trading carries risk and results vary, so do your own research. This is not financial advice. There's a strong Jewish imperative called hakarat hatov, recognizing the good. It's often done with great humility, acknowledging that we may not have earned the blessings we have in life, or feel that we especially deserve them, so we should feel all the more grateful. In Genesis 32:11, Jacob takes stock of his family and fortune, and even though he's facing a reckoning with his estranged and possibly enraged older twin, Esau, he pours out his thanks to God, saying, "I am unworthy of all the kindness and truth that you have shown your servant. I crossed this river 20 years earlier with only my staff, and now I've become 2 encampments." It's been a bit more than 20 years since I first met Nancy Zionts, but I also feel humbled by our long friendship and by the mentorship and partnership she's given me over the years. She spent more than 3 decades as Chief Program Officer of the Jewish Healthcare Foundation, during which time our work together included her reviewing the very earliest paper that would morph into the book version of Healing People, Not Patients. We ultimately worked with JHF's CEO, Karen Feinstein, to make sure that I had the support to see that book through to publication. It's a good bet that without Nancy's help, you wouldn't be listening to this podcast. In fact, she's already directly impacted one other episode, episode 7, Healing and Humanity, Ideas for the Next Generation. The students I interviewed there all had in-class mentoring from Nancy as they developed their projects, including coaching on how to make an elevator pitch, narrow the focus of a project that's too broad, and make a vague idea into one that's measurable. And last, but certainly not least, Nancy was a driving force behind the creation of the Squirrel Hill Health Center, where I've been practicing medicine my entire career. Nancy and I could, and often do, discuss anything under the sun for an hour. This particular conversation is about grief, something we don't spend enough time on in medical training, but definitely should. It's a pleasure to invite you to join us.
No room for the soul that's in my head. No room for the soul that's in my heart.
When someone's sick, they're not just dealing with annoying symptoms. They're confronting some of life's biggest questions. I'm Dr. Jonathan Weinkle, and you're listening to Healing People, Not Patients. Join us as we explore how to make our practice about complete healing, healing of the body and the spirit. Right. Nancy, welcome.
Welcome to my home.
Right. Welcome to your house. This is a very different experience for me. I'm going to try to ignore the screen in front of me because usually I'm recording somebody who's hundreds or thousands of miles away. And here we are a couple of miles from my house in your dining room with a little guest in front of us.
Little schnauzer.
Hi, Max. We can just see his snout. So for those of you listening on audio, know that there is a schnauzer who will keep popping up a table every once in a while. Hi. Okay. So I know way more of your bio than you probably want us to go through, but Nancy Zionts is a dear friend from a long time ago with whose family I am deeply enmeshed, and bits and pieces of that will come up. But we are here this evening to talk about a topic that I know more about than I ever expected to because of work that you made me do. So let's get started. We're here to talk about Greece, actually. And in sort of getting to know this, one of the things that happened when you and I first became friends and started working together was very early in my med school career. I'd known your late mother-in-law, the blessed memory, Shirley, since I was 5 years old. So I've been an honorary Zionts that long. However, you and I started working together right around the time I started med school. And very shortly into that period, both of us through some pretty serious losses in our families. And I discovered that you have many superpowers, but one of them is that you rule Shiva. You understand that period in people's lives better than almost anybody I know. And I'm really curious to understand, first of all, as we're talking, not everybody in the audience is Jewish, kind of explaining that process and how it is that you acquired said superpower.
So I grew up in Montreal, Canada, and I grew up in a not religious household, but as many Montreal Jews, we are very familiar with the Jewish calendar. We're very familiar with Jewish rituals, and we take them very seriously. Similar to Pittsburgh, we have only one Jewish funeral home in Montreal. So we were all raised with the same sort of rules and regs as to what one does. I had some losses in my life when I was in Montreal early on. I had a friend of mine who lost her husband when she was, now that I think about the ages, it's ridiculous. He was 31, she was 29. And when I think about that now, that at the time we knew it was far too young, but I didn't put it in the context of my life as I grew older. And before he died, and he was an affirmed atheist, he called and asked me if I would be his kaddish, his mourner, the person who would take on the responsibility of keeping his name and his memory alive within the rules and regs of Jewish tradition. He called me before he was disconnected from a ventilator. My parents were still alive, and in Jewish tradition, if your parents are still alive, you are not supposed to be somebody else's mourner without asking your parents' permission. So I asked my parents' permission, and I told them I was going to do it anyways, but I asked their permission. So it's one of those things.
That doesn't surprise me at all.
So I became, at an early age, I was 18, I became responsible as somebody's mourner. And I learned what that was. I learned that was about saying the mourner's prayer in those days, because I didn't go to an Orthodox synagogue or a conservative synagogue here. It was once a day, and it was also marking the anniversary of his death. And it was also making sure that as they grew up, his children, who were 2 and 5 when he died, knew who he was and I would give them the date every year once they reached the age of majority, and it was their responsibility as well. And so I still do that. I actually just got the letter the other day. It comes up next week on the 24th into the 25th. But that was how I learned first about setting up a Shiva for this young widow. And the Shiva, it is about sitting for 7 days and giving yourself over to the process of remembering and of taking yourself outside of community and your daily routine to give yourself over to that period of grief. And I remember a rabbi at the time telling me that if you give yourself over to the process, you don't try to say, I'm going to still go to work, and then I'm going to come home, and then I'm going to have people come over to the house and we're going to feed them or whatever. If you give yourself over to that period of time, removing yourself from obligation of your daily life, but giving yourself over to the obligation of mourning and of grief, it can be very healing. And 7 days seems to be a long enough period of time for that initial physical change your body goes through, the sleeplessness or the lack of appetite, for those things to at least form themselves in a way that allows you to go on and then re-enter back into community. So I learned it at a very early age. And if you think I'm an expert at Shiva, you should meet my older sister, Susan, who adds to her understanding of the ritual, her understanding of the catering component of it, which is a whole different issue.
And I'm married to somebody who really gets that piece.
Because food and taking care of people's primary needs is also something that is a part of the process that allows you to come out of the Shiva period, the 7-day period, feeling better off than you started, not worse off than you started. And I was always taught that the first 3 days of Shiva, because while it's a 7-day period, we don't conduct or sit on the Sabbath, which if you have a 7-day period, it's going to be in there somewhere. And so the first 3 days are considered the heaviest period of mourning. And the last 3 days are considered, I won't say lighter, but if there are tunes in the prayers that are said, they're often said in the first 3 days and sung in the last 3 days. So you learn all of those things over time. And I also became one of those people in the community that is not afraid to go to a Shiva house, to conduct a service in a Shiva house, to talk to mourners, that does not intimidate me at all.
Yeah. And you and I have both been called upon
Yes.
or volunteered to go to houses where we didn't know the family and just stood up because somebody needed to. So that's a really
And I was in this community proudly in our synagogue, the first woman to do that, to be added to the list. And when I was first added to the list after my father died in 2002, in those days, sometimes they would let a woman come and lead a service and sometimes they wouldn't. And then almost quickly thereafter, without my saying anything, which was amazing, they realized that if they were calling on our synagogue, it should follow our synagogue rules. And that is, if a woman is able to lead it in the synagogue, she should be able to lead in the house. I make a distinction. If the family doesn't want a woman leading, that's the only time that I would back off. And sometimes we have families where people have different levels of servants. And if my job is to be there to bring comfort to the mourners, disturbance in their family or in their force is not bringing comfort. So I back off.
There's a time to have those arguments and
Correct.
there's a time, whether it's politics or egalitarianism or whatever.
Correct. But that's not the place to do it. That's not what the family needs. And so if you're doing anything for any mourner at any time in the mourning period, it's about them. It's not about it.
The one thing that I do remember, the one argument that I will have is if I'm close enough to the mourner, you talked about giving yourself over, the argument about, no, really, sit down and let people who are helping help.
If I say it once, I say it 10 times every time I visit a Shiva house, you're not allowed to say thank you. Don't thank me for coming to do the service. It is my obligation in Judaism to comfort a mourner. And I take that fairly seriously. It is my obligation to go there and at least reduce their burden for a little bit, not add to it by them having to get me food or water. Not the deal.
For sure. And not having them say, take this food with you when you go. Right?
I was taught you can't take anything out of a Shiva
Me too.
house.
You might have taught me.
Oh, that could be. But I was taught that growing up, that you can't take anything out of a Shiva house. And so I don't. But I was also taught that it is not necessarily a place for complete sadness. It is a place for discussion about not your life, but the life of the person who is parent. And I used to teach at some of the nursing homes in town, the Jewish nursing home in particular, where they asked about the rituals of death and dying and what were the right things or the wrong things to do for a family. And I gave them my two basics. If they were the staff person when somebody died in a nursing home or in a home care situation or whatever, the two things that are different than in Christianity or other religions is the instinct is to clean up and wash the body. Do not touch the body, but do not leave it alone.
Undisturbed, but not alone.
But not alone. So that, words matter. Words matter. And those two. Yeah, you do not leave a person alone once they've passed. But you also have to hold back that instinct to clean them up or whatever, which in some religions is the first thing you do. In Judaism, that there are people who do that and it is not.
And at one point, this was the fight club of Judaism, which is the first rule of Chaver Kadisha, is you don't talk about Chaver Kadisha. Right. But those groups, Chaver Kadisha, are the sacred or secrets.
Words matter.
They do matter. I've been a part of one of those for a number of years. Also something that we'll talk in a minute about how you indirectly are responsible. That's a piece of my life. But I remember before getting involved, hearing our colleague Stephanie Small talk about her experiences of the Chevra and how very personal and intimate and moving it was, and what a responsibility it was. And also about how her husband, who is descended from the class of the high priests in ancient Israel, and therefore forbidden to be in contact with an unrelated dead body, fulfills his part of the mourning ritual by building caskets. Because he's a very handy sort of. You brought up the whole idea of not being in complete mourning and sharing. Right. So I certainly remember a Shiva that took place just the other side of that window for your beloved husband and my dear friend Leon 7 years ago. And that was certainly all about his very large and colorful and musical personality. And there was a lot of warmth and a lot of joy mixed in with all that sadness. My father-in-law passed 6 months ago. Very similar sort of thing. You couldn't talk about Napoleon Murawski without telling funny stories about him needing 3 alarm clocks and phone calls from all of his friends to get through his Kaplan review class to pass his medical boards, or
And my
any of
father
the other
was
things
like
he
a
did.
stand-up comic. He only
Mhm.
spoke in one-liners. So you would
Right.
expect to Shiva was only one-liners and bad jokes
That's
and
good.
dad jokes and
7 days of one-liners. Okay.
better than puns, but even one. There are certain things in Judaism that people say are forbidden, and music is one of them. So we dispensed with that early on. We dispensed
Mhm.
at the funeral, and you were part of that because we were
Mhm.
singing and we had a guitar with the rabbi's participation and your
Mhm.
participation, because it was just something that was so much a part of his life. And every night after the formal part of Shiva, where we had the service, so where I sat on the low chairs, because as Montrealers, we sit on low chairs. Pittsburghers sit on regular size chairs, apparently. Every night at 9 o'clock, dozens of people showed up through the backyard of my house, because that's how they know how to get here. They were actors, they were musicians. My husband was an actor and a singer, and they lit up the fire pit in the back, and they gathered and they were ready. And it was called Singing Him to the Stars. And they sang, and it was amazing. Every single night was different. Every single night had certain people were here every night, and other people came once or twice, different theater companies and whatever. And one of the things that was the nicest was there were some young people, including great nieces and nephews of mine, who had a really hard time accepting his death because he was young and it was pretty fast, but they could get behind that sort of gathering of community. So the inside the house and the service, which they came and participated in for their uncle, was one thing, but then the outside and watching people laugh and sing and tell stories was a whole different thing. So it took all of it to help people get.
Yeah. No kidding. So in between our first encounters with these rough times and Leon's passing, we worked together for several years on an initiative called Closure, which was your idea of something that I should be doing, which was
And
not
I was
mine.
right, but I was right.
You were right. You were right. And between us, it was definitely your idea, no one else's. So I was straight out of residency. I had spent some time working with some of the leading voices in the movement to talk openly and frankly with patients about death and dying. And Bob Arnold's the most well-known of them, but I will remember also Gary Fisher and Susan Hunt and a number of other people who taught me tremendous amount about these sorts of things. And I had a day a week that was not spoken for. And you said, come work with me. We're at the Jewish Healthcare Foundation at the time. And Closure was something that was new to take those conversations into the community. What made that project necessary?
So my involvement with professionally with issues of death and dying, personally, I told you, but professionally started on my first day of work in Pittsburgh, September 17th, 1984. I worked at Forbes Health System, which is now part of Allegheny Health Network. And I was hired, biggest mistake they ever made, as a financial analyst while they were
Because that's what kind of job you get when you're a chemist.
That's the kind of job you get when you need your green card and they offer you a job and that's what you do.
Right.
A chemist with an MBA, you take a finance job. And 2 weeks later, it turned into the strategic planning job that I wanted. And that was fine. But on day one, they were trying to keep me busy and they sent me across the street to Forbes Hospice for a quality improvement meeting and a finance meeting. And so they're sitting there and they're going through charts, the last quarter, the statistics of the quarter, like we do on at Forest Squirrel Hill Center. And they had length of stay in hospice. And so they're talking about length of stay over the past 3 months. It was 17, 19, and 21. So first day of work, I raised my hand from the back of the room, shy as I am. And I said, I'm sorry, 17, 19, or 21, what? And this was 1984. And the metric for length of stay in hospice was hours. And it stayed with me because hospice is one of those services when you ask people what was helpful to them in the passing of someone that they loved. And if you ask people in modern healthcare a number of years ago, what was the biggest advance in 30 years? They said hospice. And yet so many people were getting less than 24 hours in hospice. And what was the reason behind that? And the reason was doctors not being willing to, quote unquote, give up their patients to hospice, to give up on their patients and give up their patients to hospice. So it was only after almost hospice could not be of much use to them. You couldn't even get the intake done well. You couldn't get the family and the patient familiar with the setting, and then they were gone. So that was always something that stayed with me. And through my 10 years at Forbes, I was involved in a lot in aging and work with hospice. And, and that's how I met Bob. And we tried to look at that issue. But it was the more and more we looked at the statistics, more and more we looked at when you interviewed people, about what mattered to them at end of life and what they felt was missing, they said they never really had good conversations with their health provider. And we tried to figure out why that was. Was it that they were bad people? No. Was it that they didn't see the value in it? No. They hadn't been trained. So you wouldn't want somebody driving a car that hadn't been trained. You wouldn't want somebody performing surgery on you that hadn't been trained. Why was this something that we felt wasn't necessary to include in their training? Where was the human side of what we're doing? Now, most people to get into medical school, and I was a chemist, I was pre-med, I was accepted to medical school, chose not to go. All of my studies were science. They were humanities. And yet we want them to have these skills on the humanities side, and yet we don't give them any opportunity to understand them or to practice them. We have everything else is practice. We were looking at this opportunity to change how people talk about death and dying. And it was always very important to me that we use the word death. And that's because as an individual, not a clinician, when a family member or a person knows that they're dying, they know that they're dying, and skirting around the issue and not saying the word, I think distances you from a real honest conversation.
Right.
At the Jewish Healthcare Foundation, it was one of those areas where we didn't take on issues that other people avoided.
Right.
And this was one of those. People really weren't interested in talking about death and dying. It wasn't what health systems wanted to be measured at. Mortality was such a horrible thing. That was a statistic you tried to avoid, high levels of mortality and those sorts of things. So, but we thought it was so important to the human experience and to being able to go on productively after you lose a loved one. So if you don't have the ability to have that sort of language about it and understanding, then we felt people would be behind.
Yeah. And I'll say that one of the impacts of working on closure had on me was that I did a lot of the background reading and preparation of some of the teaching modules. And I eventually accumulated so much material that I first had enough for an OSHER class.
Right.
OSHER, for those who don't know in the audience, is a sort of mini college for older adults that
Lifelong learning.
Lifelong learning. Thank you. That's the word that we use. And that's like a 5 to 7.5 hour course, usually talking about 5 lessons. And I found that every time I taught it, there was stuff that I had to leave out and more stuff that I had to leave out. And eventually took that to the Honors College at Pitt and to the Religious Studies Department and turned it into a full semester class that I've now been teaching, coming up on 11 years of teaching that course. Just developed for those who are listening, who are Pitt students who have room in their fall semester schedule and want to take an asynchronous class. It will be taught as an online asynchronous class for the first time in fall of 2026. I know, called Death in the Healthcare Professions. And from where we started with those conversations, it's now all about understanding what it is that we think and feel about death, especially the kinds of beliefs that you talked about and the kind of traditions that we come from, how that shapes what we think about death, and then how that affects the decisions that we make when we're up against it, whether that's our psychology as we're going through things, starting by looking at what Elizabeth Kubler-Ross wrote in the 60s, what the foundation that carries her name teaches about it today, and a bunch of other ways of looking at people's psychology around getting ready for their own passing. And then also what we actually do when we have to decide about things like dialysis or about things like ventilation and about where we want to be when we pass.
And who we want to be with. I can do this with your readers. It usually takes 30 seconds, but I always ask any class or group that I speak at, and I'm called to speak at a lot of them, I ask everybody to close their eyes for 30 seconds. And a lot of people are frightened to close their eyes for 30 seconds, so I usually get them to do it. And then I ask them to think about somebody that really matters to them in their lives and to think about what they would want for them as a good death, where it would be, who would be around, what are the sounds that they would hear, what are the smells. And you get back a tremendous amount of commonality from people. They want to be at home for the most part. And frankly, if somebody wants to die hooked up to machines, I'll be their biggest advocate. But they should get what they want. But if they want to be home with their family, with their pets, with music, with the smell of chocolate chip cookies or the smell of something, then we should have a healthcare system that allows people to get there. And in order to get there, you have to know and you have to ask and you have to solicit that sort of information. And then that turns you into an advocate for your patient to make sure that if you can see the trajectory because you've seen 1,000 patients like that, and you know what the timing is more than the patient who's gone through it for the only and first time, then you have some kind of a greater obligation to say, maybe it's time to amp up this conversation or to tell them. The greatest gift I was ever given by a friend of ours who's a physician, a hospice physician. He took myself and my 2 kids aside. His only visit here, because my husband was in home hospice for just a short period of time, at home for a few months, told us he's going to die this week. And we didn't know the signs that he was going to die that week. That was such a gift to us because it gave us the opportunity to not say, oh, you know, and I was going to talk to him. I'll talk to him about this next week, or I'll tell him this.
Right.
And whether he was right or wrong, everything else after that would have been a gift. But he told us that on Friday night, and my husband was dead noon on Sunday, 12:17 on Sunday. And so having that 36 hours of the 4 of us and a dog together was a real gift. And that came from conversation and honesty with a healthcare provider.
Yeah, for sure. And sometimes the strangest things that you remember, right? So the last thing I remember Leon saying to me was, nice suit. He was looking at a picture of my son singing, singing in the Alderdice Cabaret and the video. And I'm pretty sure he appreciated the singing, but he said, nice suit.
Yeah, nice suit.
Like the way he was dressed.
It is interesting because we're still not good at prognostication around.
Right. Though apparently I am a pretty accurate prognostic sign in your family.
Yes, that's pretty good. And my daughter, I have one of my daughters, I don't want to out her for this sort of superpower, but she's been present at 3 deaths in our family and people won't invite her over. So
I was told that I'm also not welcome. Somebody else is on hospice.
Although they are both comforting individuals, you and she, that it's not the worst thing in the world if that's the last spaces that you're among the last spaces that you say.
Right.
So I wouldn't argue.
But by the same token, if we're talking about grief, that has made a difference.
Oh, 100%.
Because there are stories of being able to say goodbye, in whether it's in this house,
right,
your mother-in-law's apartment,
right,
like wherever it was. My wife was lucky enough to be able to light the first 2 nights of Hanukkah candles in her father's bedroom before he passed on the morning of the second day. So it was really, those are the right decisions.
It's interesting. I have a second day Hanukkah story too. When my husband, unrelated to his death 30 some odd years earlier, had a heart attack and was in a hospital that happened to be on the second night of Hanukkah. I don't know what possessed me. I brought candles and I was about to light them while he had oxygen. And I thought, it could have ended early.
You're going to be the urban.
And so I looked and I thought to myself, no, there's something very wrong about this. Just put down the candles and you'll do that later.
Speaking as a doctor who once took a lit cigarette out of a patient's mouth and extinguished it in her water cup because she had prawns in her nose while she was smoking.
So there you go.
So I do want to ask the question because you had a very simple question. We have dozens of things we could be having this kind of interview about. We have hundreds of things we could be talking about, not on camera. What made you choose this topic specifically?
So I feel a great connection to this topic. And interestingly, long before I was, as my children will say, an orphan and then a widow, long before I lost people really close to me, I've always had, maybe it comes from my teenage years where I accepted that responsibility for somebody else. But I think that grief is such an overlooked topic. And so there's such an attempt to trivialize it and to move it along. And it's one of those things that I can't stand. So I'm 24 years out and 2 months from my father having died. And I'm almost 7 years out from my husband having died. My husband died before I was finished my year of mourning for my husband. My mother died. And before I was finished the year for my mother-in-law died. And then before I was finished with that, don't trivialize it, one of my dogs died.
I remember.
So I was in a period of mourning for quite some period of time, but I wasn't incapacitated by my grief. And I know some people are incapacitated by grief. I was lucky enough to have wonderful children. I was lucky enough to have ritual, which I appreciated. I think the timetable in Judaism, I wish other religions have it. When I see friends of mine post on Facebook that it's a really hard day for them, it's 16 years since their mother died or years or whatever. And I always feel so badly that they're struggling with apologizing for that day meaning something to them, when in fact in Judaism, we build it in. It's a day every year, and 4 times a year when we gather for joyous holidays, we build in memorial prayers. If you build in a place for grief, you give it an outlet so that the pressure doesn't build too much and it explodes. But you know that there are going to be holidays coming, and holidays are hard. And special events. I just became a grandmother. I have a wonderful granddaughter who was named for my late husband.
Which is also one of our traditions.
But it's one of those things that is sadness and joy together. And finding a place for your grief in the midst of joy is something really important. And yet we don't talk about it. We talk about getting over it. We talk about you should grieve for a spouse for this amount of time, for a parent for this amount of time. You never get over. And I am blessed never to have had the loss of a child. But I will say my mother-in-law never recovered from the loss of my husband, her son.
Mhm.
You never get over the loss of a child. It's unnatural. We don't talk about it. We look at people. I'll tell you my least favorite part of people dealing with anybody's grief is the head tilt. It drives me crazy. They look at you and they immediately, they feel so sorry for you. You don't feel sorry for somebody. You want to bring joy to someone who's grieving? Ask about the person they lost. Learn something about this person.
Yeah.
Or even better yet, and my friends, particularly in theater, know this, give me a story I don't have. Give me the gift of a memory I don't have. Give me the gift, and many people do. 3 times a year, I ask for it on Facebook, a picture that if you're not sure if I have it or not, send it to me. And we call those new to me photos because there will never be new photos.
Right.
But there will be new to me photos. And if you think that I will cry when I see it, maybe I will, but I will most likely laugh and enjoy it. It is a piece of them that I didn't have that now I have. So I think that giving people an understanding that grief isn't about sadness. It's an outlet for love. You don't grieve if you didn't love. You can fake grieve if you didn't love. That's okay too. You can follow the rituals and the obligations, but true grief comes from true love.
Yeah. And I think that the idea that you talked about of having an outlet on a regular basis, you said it would explode if we didn't have that outlet, but if it doesn't explode outward, sometimes it burns deep inside. So I've taken care of people with chronic pain disorders and various things like that. And they will come in bent double in pain when it's the anniversary of their loved ones.
And if you don't ask,
especially if there's a feeling of guilt or something like that surrounding it.
You might not know. So in some of the other work we've done in nursing homes, it's looking at the behaviors of people who sometimes it's someone living with dementia, but sometimes it's not. And their behavior changes and trying to figure out why did their behavior change? And you realize maybe it's the birthday of somebody that they love. Maybe it doesn't have to be the anniversary of the death. It could be the birthday. It could be their anniversary. There are days on everybody's calendar that have meaning for them. And once the person you shared that day with is gone, that day is tough for you. And again, it doesn't have to be crippling, but it is something that you remember.
Speaking of new, and this may not be new to you, but I'm hoping it is because it would be fun to share. You said, don't mock me for the grief over the dog. I wouldn't think of it. So your father-in-law of blessed memory dearly loved him. I particularly loved sitting next to him in synagogue when he would fake translate the Russian greeting that the cantor would give, which always came out as something like, I'm very glad to see everyone here this morning. It's raining in Moscow, but there's sunshine in our hearts.
100%.
He never
verbatim.
Loved him, but he was never one to call me on the phone.
Right.
One day our phone rings and my wife, Vita, picks it up and she says, hello. It says, hi, it's Al Zionts.
Okay.
Hi. And she knew immediately that something was wrong. And he said, Leon's dog died.
Oh.
And I think it was Fezzik.
It was Fezzik. And it was June 6th. And I was in Washington, D.C. And I got a call from Leon and he was shrieking so loud. I wasn't sure if it hadn't been a home invasion and he hadn't been stabbed. That is the sound I can still hear in my ears. And he had come home and he had gone up the stairs and he found the dog dead at the top of the stairs. We think he was poisoned. There was some poison in Frick Park at that time or whatever it is. And he was shrieking like I have never heard anything before. And we called his brother and sister-in-law who came over. We called a few people who came over and it was devastating. I was not. And so I came home the next day from Washington and it was horrid. It was absolutely horrid. The love is real. The loss was real. The shock was real. Yeah. But I will tell you something funny apropos of that. So the next day we take the dog in a laundry basket as one does to the vet, because if you take the dog to the vet, they will do cremation, dispose, send you back the ashes and whatever. And after we dropped off the dog, he got in the car and he broke down in tears, sobbing. And he said to me through his tears, I'm really sorry I wasn't there for you as I should have been when your father died. And I, of course, burst out. Because to him, they were equivalent because loss is loss. love and loss is love and loss. That
Mhm.
was the lightening of the load for me at
Mhm.
that time, was the comparison, because it was also another lesson to me that loss is loss. And you don't judge other people's losses on a scale of where you think they should fall in terms of extent.
I take care of not a few people who would not be alive today if it were the love of their pets. Right. Not only the love that they see, the obligation they feel to take care of the pets, but the love that the pet gives them.
100%.
So there's no mockery there. There was something else that I was going to bring in, but the story with your father-in-law and the dog just derailed me.
Sorry.
But we'll come back to it.
Okay.
I remember what it was.
Okay.
You've been talking a lot of, and I totally agree with you, the wisdom of how much structured activity Jewish tradition builds into it. And I think having things to do really does help us to get through the things. You once gave me a book when we were working on closure called Tear Soup.
Yes.
And the whole point of Tear Soup is she's stirring the soup and they keep coming and asking her if the soup is ready. And she says, it'll be ready when it's ready, which is a deliberate metaphor for our grief is mature and something we can step away from when we're ready, but we don't know when that's going to be. But the structured activity of Shiva, having 7 days and then 30 days.
As their annual and then every year.
Right. Really helps. I mentioned that Vita has a particular talent for Shiva as well, and in particular for the food and paper goods and all of that aspect of it, and has organized that for many people over the years. And so actually her own template that she created for someone else's Shiva turned into the template that she just handed somebody and said, here, I know I'm not supposed to do anything. When her father-in-law died, they took over and did it. Her least favorite thing in Judaism is that there is a tradition that if you die right before one of the 3 major holidays, the Shiva is canceled. And we just went through this with a friend of mine where the Shiva was a few hours and then it was over. And she's been railing about that for years. And I had an answer and then I got another answer. So the most recent answer was from my friend who's been a guest on this podcast as well, Miriam Fenster, who said, oh, yeah. So in Israel, what we do is that there's, after the holiday's over, people come over and they might bring you food and I'll sit with you and ask you about the person that died. It's not Shiva. And if you really don't feel like going to synagogue, enough people will come over that they can have a service in your house, but it's not Shiva. And you can say kaddish, but it's not Shiva, right? So words matter. And in this case, it's the word you don't say out loud. It's a rose by any other. The other tradition that I love very much, it didn't quite sit well with her, but it was a Rosh Hashanah sermon that I heard a few years ago from Rabbi Shira Stutman that a good reconstruction is like yourself, that when you have that happen in temple times, people would have to, well, they'd still have to make the pilgrimage to the temple for the festival. And that was the reason why you didn't keep mourning, because you had to go. But if you went into the temple and you were in the middle of mourning, you would walk around the altar in the opposite direction of everybody else. And so when people saw you coming towards them, they would stop and say, what happened to you? And you would tell them, father-in-law passed, or my brother passed, or my husband passed.
There are a number of opportunities to let the community know that the person in your midst is a mourner, which I think is also really important. So one of them is the function of kriya, ripping a piece of your clothing. There's some Book of Job, ripping a piece of your clothing to designate you as a mourner. And I have been in the Pittsburgh airport, and there was somebody who had a black ribbon on, and they were sitting down having a drink before they were getting on an airplane. And I went over to them and I simply said, I'm sorry for your loss. And they were a little taken aback, and then they weren't. And I said, was it someone maybe that I knew? It was Carolyn King, who had been a teacher of our kids.
My teacher.
She said, you look familiar. I said, had been at the Shiva the night before. But that marked this person as a mourner, so that if you knew, you could offer them that little bit of comfort, that little bit of kindness, ask about a story. So that's one way that we do it.
It's the stories about her.
But the other way is if you're in a service in synagogue and it's the time for the mourner's prayer, the mourner's prayer usually comes after something where we are all seated, and then the mourners rise for the prayer. So you get to look around the room and you get to see who may be a new mourner or who may be somebody who's marking a day. And that way, if you have a little bit of kindness in you that day, you know that's a person who may do it. That's the second way. And the third way that I do it in a Shiva house, and I don't know if everybody else does it, but at the end of the service, the evening service, where there's mourner's kaddish, the prayer is for anybody who is a mourner or observing an anniversary of a death at that time, but you could be going to a Shiva, which I did after my husband died for the 11 months. I was at someone else's Shiva. When it came time to do the mourner's prayer, I stood for the mourner's prayer. But then when I lead a service, I do a psalm or a reading after that and give a chance for a second kaddish for just the immediate mourners.
Yeah.
So then it's again that special time for them and their grief to be able to come forward and to remind people that those are the people who need you right now. The people marking at a year, 2 years, 20 years, 50 years, they need you and they need your compassion, but the immediate mourners may need it. You don't leave without greeting the immediate mourners. But we have a number of ways in Judaism, and until you asked that question, but they all come to mind for me right away. The reason I give myself so much over to this idea of supporting mourners, I got from Nina Butler. Nina Butler is a mutual friend of ours who runs the organization Bikr Holy, which helps people who are going through medical conditions and need support. And
again, for those who don't speak our lingo, that's for visiting the sick, which really means supporting the sick and their families. And I used to joke with her. I said, there's 613 commandments we are required to do. And I said, how do you get them all in? And she says, I don't. She said, you're supposed to, but I don't. She said, but I pick a few and I do them well. And I just told her this story a few weeks ago. It was then that I decided that I was going to pick a few around death and dying and grief and mourning and supporting mourners and do my best to do them well. So Zarki Rudovsky from our synagogue, who's the person who runs the email to get those of us who are going to come and lead services, to volunteer to lead services, he'll tell you that if I get that email, I'm responding within 30 seconds, yes or no, but I'm not leaving him hanging. If I can do it and I can, they ask anyone available between Monday and Thursday, and I'll say I can do Tuesday and Thursday, but I can't do Monday and Wednesday. And boom, let the algorithm take care of it later and let them figure out who's going to be where. But as a community, it's our obligation. If somebody wants to gather to pray in their home, it's our obligation to make sure that's possible. There are enough people on any given day that could get off their butts for half an hour and go over and support. And you build that in a culture sort of way. I've taught my children that. So that was a new to me Nancy Zionts line. I've never heard you explain it that way. That's fantastic.
I have one other thing. I want to give credit to my older daughter, not the one who pronounces people when they die, but the other one. She lives in London, England, and we were all hooked together when my husband died. And so for the first few weeks, we were all saying kaddish together. She then goes back to London, where the traditions in England are far different from here. They don't have synagogues that are non-Orthodox, and they don't recognize women as mourners. So a man would volunteer to say the mourner's prayer for her, but she couldn't do it herself. And I'm like, this doesn't sit well with Zionts women, to be sure. She started something online called Nine Friends. I think it's called Nine Friends. It's a WhatsApp group. And it became a group for anyone who needed to say kaddish could say, tomorrow's the anniversary of my mother's death. I'm going to say kaddish. It's usually 3:00 in the afternoon, our time, because that's 8:00 England time. And anybody available. And we'll all write, yes, it's 15 minutes. We don't have to transport ourselves there. We just have to make ourselves available for someone else. And she designed a service, my daughter did, because COVID by then had started. So it was all going to be done virtually. And she designed it with a prayer for carers and a prayer for the sick and 2 or 3 poems. And she designed a service. And then we have the chance to be there for the person to tell something about the person who died, whether it's a fresh death or whether it's the Yortzeit. And we say kaddish together. And sometimes it's twice a month that we get the text. Sometimes it's much more frequent. And yet we have never failed to have 10 people there to say kaddish. And I love that. She's been doing it for 7 years.
Yeah. We discussed that the last time she was here. And having that support is really critical, because I remember watching an episode years ago of Northern Exposure where he's quizzing the people in his little town in Alaska to figure out if any of them are Jewish.
Right.
And one of the guys actually recites the Shema perfectly that you would never guess, and ultimately realizes that it's the 9 friends that he finds that are the community that he needs. I always ask 4 questions.
Yes.
I've asked you, how did you get to be a Shiva wizard? I asked you why closure started, and I've asked you why grief is our topic. This is for those who don't know how to ask, which is 4th of the 4 children. You mentioned that there's a lot of clinicians, doctors, nurse practitioners, nurses, et cetera, folks who are interacting with patients who are very ill, dying, might be dying soon, interacting with family members, interacting with people who have a new, potentially life-threatening diagnosis, who feel fine and think they're going to get better, but still need to confront that, and who don't know how to ask the question. get us started?
So I think that one of the questions that I was always taught in palliative care and end of life is asking the person what they know about their condition and their disease. And that can take you a lot of the way there. Because if they tell you something like, oh, I'm going to be fine, I just have a this, that, and the next thing, and 10 days of antibiotics, I'm going to be fine. And that's wildly different than what you know. Then you know you have an open. If they tell you that they've been waiting for this time, they knew that their disease was going to progress. And those are different ends of the spectrum, right? For you to know. I think that getting started is about asking any question that matters to you. Are your family members here for you at this time? Or does anyone have any questions about what they can expect? Or I think that most patients are looking for radical honesty without being cruel, but radical honesty. Don't gloss over the fact that this is a serious condition. It's certainly fair to say, I can't give you a timetable. It's certainly fair to say things like, I think if you have things you want to say to other family members or whatever, or I've seen 30 patients with the same sort of trajectory that you have. And for the most part, I can tell you with a little bit of certainty, not a lot, that maybe a few weeks from now, you're going to feel like you don't have the energy to do things. Give them some sense of where things are going. But at a time like that, where most of us are not looking for our doctors to pull up what they knew to get into medical school in terms of science, but we're looking for them to be human.
Yeah.
And if you can be a human, and many of them are very concerned about who they're leaving behind, not so much about themselves. So talking to the patient and making eye contact is really important, but ignoring everybody else in the room doesn't get you there. So recognizing what their community is matters.
I get the impression, certainly from our previous conversations and work together, but also from my own experience with my colleagues, I get the impression that a lot of us seem frightened of having those conversations. I know what I perceive to be the fright, but as somebody who is in healthcare, but not a clinician, what do you think they're afraid of?
So I think a lot of people have not confronted their own sense of loss. A lot of people are walking around with unresolved grief of their own. And so they bring that into the room with them. So maybe it was an experience that went bad for them. Maybe it was poor guessing on their part or poor prognostication. So they don't want that to happen to somebody else. But I think it often relates to sometimes you have a clinician who is young and fortunate and has never faced death in their life and in their circle. So they really don't know from whence they speak. You may as well have a conversation with me about soccer and basketball, other than the next one, but don't understand the rudimentary facts of the game. They may
Only
not.
because we're so happy for Danny.
We're so happy for New Yorkers written large, a lot of New Yorkers, but they may feel unable to have the conversation because, to your point, they've never studied it. They've never had anybody take the time to teach them. If I use the same cadence as we do in the Haggadah, for those, you tell them, this is something you can study. This is something you can learn. And then what will help you get better will be experience. Unfortunately, it may be experience of people around you in your personal life dying. I remember you telling me that you had been a doctor long enough that some of your first patients were dying. And that fear that you had as a professional of you're going to lose some of your patients, that doesn't happen when you don't have patients. It only happens when you do have patients. So I think that for doctors and nurses and social workers, some of them don't realize that it is such a natural part of life. I mean, I go to the cemetery fairly regularly, and when I'm out there, I see people who go once a year to the cemetery. That's fine. That's their choice. I choose to go out more often. When I'm there, call my children and we gather together and we tell stories and we sing songs and we say kaddish together remotely, London, Portland, Oregon, and Pittsburgh. And they go every time they're in town. But we've learned that.
And Max does.
And Max does, and his previous dog went as well, his dog brothers. So I think that it is something that can be learned. I think people need to learn conversation openers, and they're not the same. If they start to all be the same, that's a problem too. So they need to be what someone is comfortable with.
You need a vocabulary, not a catchphrase.
You seem quieter today than I'm used to seeing there. Is there something going on? It may have nothing to do with clinical things. It may have to be that they've just gone inside of themselves and realized. So if you're comfortable having that conversation, have it. If you go home from visiting one of your patients and you realize, I didn't get anything out of them today, they just didn't seem there. ask yourself why.
Mhm.
You don't have to have a conversation with them. Ask yourself what was different with them this time, and then figure out if there's a way in for you to be helpful.
Right. You did mention, don't be cruel about your radical honesty. We both know that there are people who are.
Yes. That doctor who told me, he's
Mhm.
going to die this weekend,
Mhm.
he did it with such kindness and reassurance. And the purpose of him telling us that was so we could do something about it. Not just so we would know that our Monday was going to be different. It had
Right.
nothing to do with that. It had to do with, I'm assessing
Mhm.
that no one has really shared with you the true severity of where we are right now. And he shared that. And he did it in such a kind and professional way that it was really very.
I wasn't thinking of him
That was my
because,
ask.
right, I
Yeah.
have only the highest respect
Yeah.
for him. I was thinking of some other folks who we won't name, but whether it's the old tradition of sort of, as they used to call it, hanging crepe, right?
Right.
The warning shots like, oh, things aren't looking good.
Right.
You say you dance around, say very negative sounding things, or you just
Things
like
like
hit them.
go
in the
home
head
and get
with it.
your affairs in order, which
That's the one I
that's
was
the one.
thinking of.
Here are my least favorite catchphrases. Go home and get your affairs in order, which nobody knows what that means. And
Mhm.
if you're hearing me say the expression, get your affairs in order, start now, it'll take you months, and it'll
Mhm.
take you months after someone dies. But think about what that means and make some
Mhm.
effort for that.
Although that is what Isaiah said to Hezekiah in the Bible. Go and get your
Go
affairs in
and-
order because you will die. And
But you don't say that in the waiting room with Shady Side Hospital
Exactly.
because that's not what
Maybe
you're
when
going to
you're
be able
talking to the kids.
Exactly. And the
Okay.
other one that I really can't stand is there's nothing more we can do for you. You know how I hate that expression.
Yes,
There
I
is
do.
always something more we can
Mhm.
do for you. It just may not be a cure, but we can carry you to death. We
Yes.
can envelop you with support, whatever that looks like. And if support means leave me alone, that's support too. But there's nothing more we can do for you is the true giving up of the provider that
Right.
makes the patient and family feel abandoned. So it makes them feel like the only success was cure, when in fact, for a lot of us, what we look for our family members is what we call a good death. The opportunity to pass, which is natural, but to do so in a way where you had maximum control and maximum support for the people that you love around you.
Yeah. And actually, that is in terms of the things that I learned from some of our friends that we were talking about, an article that Gary co-authored
Yep.
about what people are looking for and often feel they haven't gotten from their primary care doctor, people like me,
Right.
is that they feel they've been abandoned, that the specialists take over and
Right.
they disappear into hospice and they never
And they
hear from
think
them
that
again.
was your call, and it wasn't your call.
Often not, but sometimes it is. And it's coming out of that or out of that uncertainty about what to do, the discomfort with that kind of situation. And being absent is easier than being uncomfortable and potentially awkward,
Right.
clumsy, saying the wrong thing,
Mhm.
nothing at all.
Right.
And I think
Yes,
that's
and one of the other
big
pieces of grief that I think people sometimes minimize is there's anger and there's guilt. So there are people who are angry that the person died, or angry with what happened, or angry with how they left them and the circumstances that they left them in. They didn't get their affairs in order, that sort of thing. So sometimes there's anger. Sometimes there's residual anger for they were never a good person in my life, and here I am obligated to pretend. So there's anger, but the other part of it is the guilt. If you've taken care of somebody for a very long time, and I think about this with people who are taking care of persons with dementia over a long period of time, you lose them more than one. So you lose them when the relationship between you has changed because there is different memory and there's different behavior, et cetera. But then you lose them again when they leave this earth. And sometimes that's the one that provides relief, and then that relief turns into guilt.
Right.
So these things are all tied up. And I think that people really don't understand grief. 7% of grief is complicated. 93% of grief is working through what you're dealing with in terms of loss. But 7% of it is complicated grief. And if you see somebody crying, I'm not a crier, but if you see somebody crying, or you see, as you did, that person with bent over in pain,
Yep.
couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, that for more than a period of time that would seem to be, as a clinician, normal, then there's maybe some reason to step in and try to figure out what's at the root of it, or what could be some way to help them build their way back. But for most people, letting them go through stages of grief, letting them go through anger, letting them go through disappointment, letting them go through all of the emotions in the rainbow, let them go through them all. And they will be different for every person you lose. So losing somebody in a generation above you may feel different than losing someone in a generation below you, or someone on the same generation, someone you hadn't seen in a long time. They may all be different, but they're workable. if we give people the space to work through them and the supports to work through them.
And I think that's a good place for us to wrap up. You're good at getting the last word. What would you like it to be?
Oh, I was enjoying that last word. The last word I would say to you is another way that you lose someone a second time is when you stop saying their name. Saying the name of someone who's died and telling stories about someone who's died is very comforting to the living. I am blessed in the 6.5 years since my husband has passed away. 3 babies have been born and given names that were associated with my husband. So that gives me at least a full other generation of people who will know his name. So that matters to me a lot. So I do all of this work in the name of my husband, who was Nancy Zionts, who was the voice of death. He was very involved in this work, and he did some of the videos for Pitt, also for the Second Conversation videos with Bob Arnold. And I would close on a funny story about that. He was in the room. I was outside of the room when he was having these conversations. It turns out to be 6 months before he died, 3 weeks before he was diagnosed. And Bob Arnold's conducting conversations with him as an old man for him to make decisions around his end of life. And Judy Black comes out and says, I think you should go in and talk to your husband. He's crying. I said, okay. So I go in and I said, Leon, they're a little concerned about you because you're crying. He said, they told me to cry. I said, thank you very much. He's an actor.
He's an actor.
You get him an actor. You told him to cry and he cried and now you're complaining about it. So there you go.
The dog's crying too. And my last word is based on what you said about stories. One of the most moving things that I've seen is a number of couples that we are close to, including Zarky and Marion, that are second marriages. They've both lost spouses. And to hear them each talk about the people from whom they were widowed while still clearly being very much in love with each other, that keeping the memory of the relationship that was alive and also having essentially given birth to a new relationship and a new chapter in their lives, that really fills me with hope.
I go for dogs and kids, but that's...
I'm not suggesting anything for you. That is way out of...
By the way, I did not enjoy the people who tried to fix me up within a month of my... That's it.
It wasn't me.
I understand. I know who
All
they
right.
were.
Thank you so much for this conversation. I have a feeling this is not the only episode we're in.
You're welcome anytime.
In the cold open, I spoke about Jacob and his deep expression of gratitude. But he's relevant to this episode not just as a model for thanking my dear friend, but unfortunately as the Torah's greatest example of complicated grief. Jacob spends 22 years assuming that his favorite son, Joseph, has died. Right from the beginning, he refuses comfort. He tells his sons, no, I will go down mourning to my son in Sheol. According to one tradition, which I learned from Rabbi Ori Topolsky, during those 22 years, Jacob was even unable to pray, despite having spent his earlier life in free conversation with God. Years later, after Joseph has turned up alive and well and living in Egypt, Jacob is still broken and bereft. Hearing the news, he stops the report in the middle, saying, this is too much for me. I will go and see him before I die. When he arrives in Egypt, Pharaoh, never having seen someone so old as Jacob, asks him his age. Despite seeing how young and short-lived the Egyptians are, Jacob answers, few and hard have been the years of my life. I shared a couple of stories with Nancy of people I care for that remind me of Jacob. They're living their lives in deep despair or physically disfigured from losses they suffered many years ago. It's particularly common and particularly reminiscent of this biblical story among my patients who have fled or been driven from their homelands and lost many loved ones along the way. For many of them, unresolved, complicated grief has not just taken their spouse or their child, but their memory, their confidence, and their health. I spoke a little about this with Nahma Rohani and Ashok Gurung last fall. Take a listen to episode 5, Because You Were Strangers. It's true that there's no timeline for, quote, getting over it, other than the one that says that it's never a good time to tell someone to get over it. But there are ways to process grief, to heal from it, and to find what Dr. Erica Brown calls inspiration to go on in a world where the person who has died is no longer. As healing professionals, we have the opportunity every day to accompany people through the long, sometimes painful process of finding that inspiration. It doesn't come all at once, and it often comes with painful understandings, confrontations with truths we, and they, would rather not face. When Jacob finally does see Joseph for the first time, he breaks his silence and begins to pray Shema Yisrael, listen Israel, his own new name, as if talking to himself, reminding himself that God is one, and the author of all the things that have happened, the wondrous and the heartbreaking. We heard in episode 1 from my friend Alicia Waldman about how tempting it can be to try to direct someone in a moment like that, to steer them toward the positive and away from the sadness or the guilt. The real challenge is to say nothing, to sit with the grief, be present for the struggle, to keep coming back while so many things remain unresolved. We never know what will work for a particular person. Fervent prayer, show tunes, dad jokes, starting a charity, writing a novel. We only know what doesn't work. Burying the grief along with the deceased, leaving someone alone, and pretending everything's fine when it isn't. If as healing professionals we can be brave enough just to open a conversation and patient enough to sit through it until the end, healing is at hand. It may be the single greatest act of our careers. Thanks for spending time with me today. If this conversation sparked something in you, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. And share it with a colleague who could use a reminder of why we do this work. For more thoughts, explore my blog at www.healerswholisten.com/blog or follow me on Instagram at healerswholisten. For deeper dives, check out the book version of Healing People, Not Patients, or my second book, From Illness to Exodus. Links to both are in the show notes. Our theme song, Room for the Soul, is available on Bandcamp. It's a reminder that together, we can find room for the soul in medicine. This podcast is not medical advice, nor is it legal or financial counsel. It's a space for reflection, rooted in stories, spirituality, and the art of healing. For your own care, always consult the professionals who know you best.